James had never thought of his life as particularly complicated, but that evening, everything felt subtly different, like the air itself had shifted. It began with a normal family dinner, something he usually enjoyed. Claire, his wife, had prepared a light meal, and her mother, Helen, had joined them as she often did on weekends. Helen had a quiet charm, the kind of presence that made a room feel warm and inviting, and James found himself noticing little things about her he hadn't before: the way her hair fell softly around her face, the gentle curve of her smile when she laughed at Claire's jokes, the thoughtful pauses she took before answering a question as if weighing her words carefully. The conversation was light, casual, about work, small stories from the week, neighborhood gossip, and Claire's occasional teasing, but there was an undercurrent James could feel, subtle yet compelling, that made him aware of Helen in a way that was both confusing and enthralling. After the meal, Claire had to take a sudden phone call about an urgent project at work, leaving James and Helen alone in the living room, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Helen admitted she was tired and hesitant to drive home, and James instinctively offered to take her, insisting politely but with a warmth in his tone that made her hesitate only for a moment before nodding. On the drive, the city lights blurred past, painting fleeting patterns on the windows, and a quiet settled between them, not the awkward silence of strangers, but the heavy, expectant silence of two people suddenly aware of something unspoken. Helen gazed out at the passing streets, and James found his attention caught by the way her eyes reflected the golden glow of streetlights, how the soft rise and fall of her breath seemed to fill the car with an unexpected intimacy. He thought about her stories, the way she spoke about her life, her small regrets, her quiet loneliness, and he realized he felt protective of her, concerned for her comfort in a way that went beyond ordinary courtesy. When they arrived at her house, he helped her with her coat, careful to keep his gestures polite, yet he noticed how her fingers lingered for a moment on his hand, a small, fleeting touch that sent a ripple of something he couldn't name through him. Inside, the house smelled of warm vanilla and lavender, a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension in his chest. Helen invited him to stay for a cup of tea, something he hadn't expected, and he agreed, telling himself it was merely polite, but the quiet flutter in his chest told him it was far more than that. As they sat in her living room, the soft light from the lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls, Helen spoke with surprising openness about her feelings, her loneliness since her husband had passed, the subtle regrets she carried from choices she had made, and the longing she felt for connection, for someone who truly saw her. James listened, offering small words of comfort, gestures of understanding, feeling a bond growing with each shared sentence, each laugh that came from a place deeper than surface amusement. He realized the emotional weight of the evening, the way time seemed to slow when they were talking, the way his chest tightened when she smiled, the way her eyes met his with a warmth that made him forget the world outside. When the tea was finished, James lingered, both of them hesitant to break the moment, aware of the line they were close to crossing but unspoken, and in that silence, in that small, glowing room, he felt the stirrings of an attraction that was emotional first, tender, protective, something that had nothing to do with physical desire but everything to do with hearts connecting across years, across the unspoken longing each carried. Finally, realizing the night was late, he stood to leave, but Helen paused at the door, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, a touch so soft it seemed almost accidental, yet it left a warmth in the air between them, a charge that made it impossible to ignore the pull he felt toward her. James stepped back into the car, driving home with thoughts swirling in his mind, feeling both exhilarated and guilty, knowing that something rare and delicate had sparked in that quiet evening, a connection that neither could name yet both felt deeply. The drive back was silent, each lost in their own thoughts, the city lights streaming past like fleeting memories of a night that had already begun to feel significant, like the first brush of something new, something forbidden, something tender that could grow into a bond neither had expected but neither could deny. By the time James arrived home, the memory of Helen's smile, the softness in her eyes, and the quiet intensity of her presence lingered in his mind, leaving him restless, aware that this evening had changed something, that the ordinary course of family life had been interrupted by a spark he didn't know how to handle, and that tomorrow, when they saw each other again, nothing would feel quite the same, not the laughter, not the casual conversation, not even the easy comfort of shared meals. He knew, deep down, that the line between propriety and something more intimate had been crossed emotionally, that a subtle tension now existed that neither could ignore, and that the small gestures, the quiet attentions, the emotional closeness of tonight, would be the seed of a complicated, tender journey, one that promised longing, connection, and heartbreak in equal measure. As he finally climbed into bed, the soft glow of streetlights fading from his memory, James realized he was thinking of Helen not as his mother-in-law, not as a guest in his home, but as a person whose presence had stirred feelings he hadn't expected, whose voice had touched something deep inside him, and whose very being had made an ordinary evening feel charged with unspoken emotion, leaving him awake, restless, and keenly aware that this night had been the beginning of a story neither of them could have predicted, yet both would feel in the quiet spaces of their hearts for a long time to come. The days after that evening felt strangely charged for James, as if the air around him carried a new tension that hadn't been there before. He kept replaying Helen's soft smile, the gentle warmth in her eyes, and the way she had spoken of her loneliness, and he realized he looked forward to seeing her more than he would admit. One quiet evening, after another casual dinner with Claire, Helen mentioned in passing that she felt drained from the week, and James instinctively offered to drive her home, the same way he had done before. This time, though, the car ride felt heavier, more intimate, a space where words could flow without the constraints of family dynamics. Helen spoke about the small disappointments in her life, the quiet ache of feeling unseen at times, and James listened carefully, offering comfort, not with grand gestures, but with patience, attention, and a tone that made her feel truly heard. There was a subtle closeness in the way their conversation wandered from casual topics to deeper confessions, memories of youth, dreams left unfinished, the fear of growing old without meaningful connection, and James felt a tenderness that surprised him, a mix of protectiveness and longing that grew stronger with every word Helen spoke. When they reached her house, he helped her inside, making sure she had everything she needed to feel comfortable, carrying her coat, adjusting the blanket on her sofa, little acts that seemed ordinary but felt laden with emotion. Helen invited him to stay for a cup of tea, a small ritual, and although he knew he was treading on delicate ground, he couldn't refuse, drawn by the quiet intimacy between them. As they sipped the warm tea, Helen shared more than she had with anyone in years, the small regrets, the moments of loneliness, the unfulfilled dreams, the longing for someone who could truly understand her without judgment, and James found himself speaking words he had never imagined saying to his mother-in-law, offering empathy, reassurance, and a listening heart. There was laughter too, soft and gentle, the kind that seemed to echo in the corners of the room, mingling with the low hum of the evening and the shadows cast by the lamp, creating a cocoon of warmth and connection that neither wanted to leave. James noticed the way Helen's gaze occasionally lingered on him, a softness in her expression that made his chest tighten, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond forming between them, something unspoken yet undeniable, emotional rather than physical, but no less intense. They spoke of the past, of choices made and paths not taken, of fleeting love and enduring heartbreak, and James felt a complicated mixture of admiration, affection, and longing for her resilience and vulnerability. Each time he left her home that night, the drive back was quiet but filled with reflection, his mind replaying her words, her expressions, the gentle curve of her smile, the warmth of her presence lingering like a soft ache in his chest. He realized he was drawn to her not just because of her beauty, which was quiet and understated, but because of the emotional connection that had grown in these few short evenings, a bond built on honesty, care, and subtle understanding. Over the following days, James found himself seeking reasons to see Helen again, offering small gestures, a cup of tea, a kind message, a check-in call, and she responded with a warmth that went beyond mere politeness, a vulnerability that seemed to invite him in. Their conversations became the highlight of his days, moments where he could see her eyes light up with genuine appreciation, where the exchange of thoughts and emotions felt effortless, intimate, and yet carefully restrained, aware of the boundaries that existed but testing them in subtle, emotional ways. One evening, as James waited outside Helen's house after picking her up for dinner, he felt a strange hesitation, a flutter of anticipation and caution. She opened the door with a smile that seemed to acknowledge their growing connection, and he felt a rush of emotions he couldn't quite define, a mix of guilt, protectiveness, and an irresistible attraction that was emotional, tender, and stirring. Inside, the living room felt cozier than before, the soft lamplight casting shadows that mirrored the complexities of the feelings swirling between them. Helen spoke more openly about her fears of being alone, the quiet void that sometimes haunted her despite a life surrounded by family, and James listened, offering words of comfort that felt natural, heartfelt, and sincere, the kind that could only come from genuine care. The bond deepened with each story, each laugh, each moment of shared understanding, and James realized that their connection was no longer casual or fleeting, it had grown into something profound, something that touched both their hearts and lingered long after the night ended. They shared subtle gestures, a hand brushing against the other, a glance that held longer than necessary, a pause in conversation filled with meaning, that were innocent yet heavy with unspoken emotion. When it was time to leave, Helen paused at the doorway, her eyes meeting his with a softness that left him breathless, and James felt the weight of the moment, the intensity of the emotional closeness that had blossomed, a connection that felt dangerous in its intimacy but beautiful in its depth. As he drove home, the city lights streaming past blurred into a haze, his mind replaying every smile, every word, every subtle touch, realizing that something extraordinary had begun between them, a bond that was emotional first, romantic in its subtlety, and deeply moving. He knew it was complicated, that boundaries existed, yet he could not deny the longing he felt, the gentle ache that tugged at his heart, the sense that Helen had become more than a family member in his life. She had become someone who stirred emotions he hadn't expected, someone whose presence made ordinary moments feel charged with meaning, and someone whose smile could linger in his mind for hours after she had gone. That night, as James lay awake, he thought of Helen's gentle voice, her laugh, the warmth of her presence, and he realized that the evening had changed something irreversibly. He felt an emotional connection that went beyond friendship, a tenderness that carried a hint of longing, and a realization that the quiet moments spent together, the care, the conversation, the shared confessions, had woven a subtle bond that neither of them could ignore. Helen had opened a door to something intimate yet safe, emotional yet restrained, and James knew that their story was only beginning, a story of quiet longing, tender connection, and unspoken emotions that could grow into something deeply heartfelt, romantic, and unforgettable, all wrapped in the warmth of care, understanding, and emotional honesty. As he drove home, the streets dimmed by the night, James felt both the thrill and the weight of their connection, aware that each shared word and gesture was building something significant, a bond delicate yet strong, and he wondered if Helen felt it too, if she too sensed the subtle pull between them, the emotional intimacy that was transforming ordinary life into something profound, beautiful, and quietly romantic, a connection neither could fully define but both could feel deeply in their hearts. The days passed, James and Helen's connection deepened in ways neither had expected, and what had begun as casual care now carried an unmistakable weight of emotion. Every time they met after family dinners or errands, there was a quiet electricity between them, subtle gestures that spoke volumes, her smile lingering a moment longer, his hand brushing against hers as he handed her a cup of tea, a shared laugh that seemed to echo in the corners of rooms and stretch time itself. James found himself thinking about Helen at odd moments, her soft voice repeating in his mind, her thoughtful expressions replaying in flashes whenever he was alone, and he realized that their bond was no longer something he could casually dismiss. Helen, too, seemed changed. There was a softness in her eyes when he entered the room, a warmth in her tone that went beyond mere politeness, a quiet gratitude in her demeanor that carried subtle hints of longing. They spoke more openly now, stories of past loves, missed opportunities, dreams that had been shelved for years, and fears about growing older without companionship. Each conversation was layered with meaning, every sentence a gentle pull toward something neither dared name. Their meetings became small rituals of connection, a check-in call to see how the other was feeling, sharing little details from the day, bringing favorite snacks or tea, and these gestures, though ordinary, carried a charged intimacy that left both hearts fluttering and minds restless. James noticed the way Helen's presence lingered even after he left, her laugh, her thoughtful pauses, the way she seemed to fill the spaces around him with warmth, and he realized he was drawn not just to her kindness or her charm, but to the emotional depth that had emerged between them, a bond that felt fragile yet undeniably strong. Even in public, subtle cues were exchanged, a glance held a second longer than usual, a hand lightly touching his arm in passing, a quiet nod that carried understanding without words. The emotional closeness was intoxicating, and yet each moment was tempered by a gentle restraint, both aware that lines existed, that boundaries mattered, that the family dynamic could never be ignored, yet the heart has a way of bending rules when longing and empathy intertwine. James began to find himself prioritizing these moments, arranging his schedule so he could drive Helen home, ensuring she was comfortable, staying a little longer than necessary to share stories or laughter, feeling that strange mix of guilt and exhilaration that comes from the emotional thrill of connection paired with a sense of propriety. Helen, in turn, responded with gratitude, softness, and vulnerability, revealing parts of herself that had been hidden for years, trusting James in a way that went beyond friendship, and he found himself wanting to protect her, to listen, to offer reassurance, to be present in a way that was both nurturing and emotionally charged. One evening, after a particularly long dinner, the car ride to Helen's house was filled with the quiet hum of city lights passing outside and the unspoken weight of their connection. Helen spoke about her life with gentle humor and occasional melancholy, and James realized that listening to her stories felt like an honor, that each word shared was a thread binding their hearts closer together. As he helped her inside, adjusting her blanket, offering tea, and sitting to chat for a while, James felt the emotional intimacy swell, a tension that was not physical but far more intense, an attraction rooted in understanding, empathy, and the quiet beauty of two people recognizing something rare in each other. Helen's eyes sometimes lingered on him, a softness that made his chest tighten, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond forming, and James realized that every gesture, every word, every shared smile was carrying them closer to a line they both knew existed yet could not resist approaching emotionally. They shared moments of laughter, quiet reflection, and gentle teasing, the kind that builds familiarity and trust, and James found himself captivated by her voice, the cadence of her speech, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, feeling the stirrings of longing and care that were both thrilling and terrifying. Over time, these encounters became more than routine, they became a lifeline for both, a place of emotional honesty where vulnerability was welcomed, where the complexities of their feelings could exist safely, and where subtle gestures and shared glances conveyed emotions too deep to voice aloud. The tension between them was a constant undercurrent, an invisible thread that connected them even when apart, leaving James awake at night thinking of Helen, her laugh, her stories, the way she made him feel alive and understood in a way that no one else did. Helen, too, felt the pull, her mind replaying James's kindness, his attentiveness, the way he seemed to understand her in ways others had not, and she found herself smiling at small memories of their interactions, heart fluttering, aware of the emotional intimacy growing between them. Every drive home, every small act of care, every moment shared became a delicate dance of closeness and restraint, a gentle push and pull of desire and propriety, and both were acutely aware that their bond was fragile yet beautiful, a connection that could change everything yet existed in quiet secrecy. By the end of this phase, both James and Helen were entwined in an emotional narrative that was thrilling, tender, and quietly romantic, a story of longing, care, and understanding that neither could ignore, a bond that carried the sweet ache of emotional infidelity without physical crossing, leaving their hearts and minds consumed with the intensity of a connection that was delicate, restrained, and deeply moving, making every shared word and gesture a powerful testament to the emotional journey they were on, one that promised more longing, more closeness, and more emotional depth with every passing day. The connection between James and Helen had grown quietly over weeks into a bond that neither could deny, and that evening, after another family dinner filled with laughter and casual chatter, the unspoken tension reached a new height as he offered to drive her home once again, the familiar car ride now charged with an intensity that felt both thrilling and delicate. Helen looked at him with a soft, hesitant smile, the kind that conveyed gratitude, trust, and a subtle longing, and James felt his heart tighten at the sight, knowing that the emotional closeness they shared was becoming impossible to ignore. On the drive, the city lights streamed past like fleeting memories, and they spoke in whispers, sharing stories that had not been told before, revealing small secrets, quiet fears, and personal dreams that had long been tucked away, the kind of confessions that built intimacy stronger than words could describe. James found himself captivated by every detail, the inflection of her voice, the way her eyes reflected the passing lights, the gentle rise and fall of her breath as she spoke, and he realized that their connection had grown into something deeply emotional, a tender affection that was romantic in its subtlety but restrained by the boundaries they both respected. When they reached her house, James helped Helen with her coat and made sure the living room was comfortable, adjusting pillows and offering a warm cup of tea, the small acts of care now heavy with meaning and loaded with emotional weight. Helen paused at the doorway, her hand brushing against his arm in a touch that lingered longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, a quiet plea without words, and James felt the pull of longing, the ache of desire mixed with protectiveness, knowing that this emotional connection was both beautiful and precarious. Inside, they sat together in the soft glow of the lamp, sharing more stories, quiet laughs, and gentle moments of reflection, each word and glance carrying layers of meaning that neither dared speak aloud. James realized that Helen had become not just a mother-in-law, but someone whose presence stirred his heart in ways he had never anticipated, someone whose emotional honesty and vulnerability had woven a delicate thread between them that was impossible to ignore, and he felt the thrill of closeness mingled with the careful restraint of propriety. Helen's eyes met his, soft and glistening, and he could feel the unspoken emotions, gratitude, affection, longing, and the subtle, gentle hint of romantic tension that had grown over time, filling the room like a quiet storm, powerful yet contained. When it was time to leave, they both lingered, neither wanting to break the fragile moment, knowing that every shared gesture, every word, every glance had carried them deeper into a space of emotional intimacy that was tender, heart-stirring, and profoundly moving. As James drove away, the streets illuminated by passing headlights, he felt a bittersweet ache, aware of the longing he carried, the depth of connection that had formed, and the beauty of a bond that was emotional first, romantic in subtlety, and restrained by respect and awareness of boundaries, leaving him thoughtful, reflective, and quietly overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings he could neither fully express nor fully resist. Helen, watching him leave, felt a similar ache, her heart stirred by the attentiveness, care, and emotional intimacy that had been shared, the flutter of longing and unspoken affection leaving her restless yet grateful for the connection that had developed, knowing that something extraordinary had taken root in ordinary moments, something that would linger quietly in their hearts for days, weeks, and perhaps longer. Over the following nights, both lay awake thinking of the other, replaying conversations, small gestures, and fleeting touches, each memory carrying the weight of unspoken desire, restrained affection, and the gentle thrill of an emotional bond that had grown beyond ordinary family ties into something tender, romantic, and emotionally charged. They were caught in a delicate balance, drawn to each other, deeply aware of boundaries, yet unable to ignore the pull of their shared understanding, the comfort, and the subtle intimacy that had grown between them, a connection that promised longing, tenderness, and the quiet beauty of a romance unspoken but profoundly felt. Each meeting thereafter was colored by this new awareness, the soft tension making every glance, every smile, every shared laugh a meaningful event, charged with emotion, a quiet dance of hearts, a careful flirtation of souls rather than bodies, yet no less stirring or powerful. James found himself protective in ways that surprised him, emotionally vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated, and profoundly moved by the depth of Helen's stories, her quiet strength, and the subtle vulnerability she allowed him to witness. Helen, too, cherished the shared moments, the attention, and the unspoken understanding, feeling seen in ways she had not been for years, and realizing that their connection had grown into something emotionally profound, romantic in its quiet intensity, and deeply moving. Together, they navigated these subtle emotions, the gentle tension, the restrained longing, and the beauty of unspoken affection, realizing that the bond they shared was both a gift and a delicate challenge, something rare, precious, and transformative, leaving their hearts stirred, their minds reflective, and their spirits connected in ways that transcended ordinary family dynamics. That night, as James drove back home, the memory of Helen's soft gaze, her tender words, and the emotional intimacy they had shared stayed with him, a bittersweet ache, a flutter of longing, and a quiet hope that, though the world might never see or understand this connection, their story of care, longing, emotional closeness, and restrained romance, was something enduring, heartfelt, and unforgettable, leaving them both aware that love can exist in subtle forms, deep emotional bonds can flourish without crossing lines, and that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones left unspoken yet deeply felt, carried in hearts, memories, and quiet moments that linger long after the night ends.